and state as we dive into the issues surrounding the lack of specific, verifiable international norms for behavior in space. First, we have Mr. John D. Hill, performing the duties of Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting, Commander, Space Operations Command, United States Space Force, Mr. Jonathan M. Moore, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, Mr. Bruce Turner, the Senior Bureau Official, the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance. Thank you all for participating in today's hearing, and I ask you, as well as all the members, including the chair and ranking, to keep your remarks brief and to no more than 5 minutes so that we can have ample time for the number of members who are on the call to ask questions. Space has captured human imagination since the beginning of time, but it's still a long, long way from being understood by our political leaders, diplomats, and lawyers, at least in a way that the many nations of Earth can agree upon. Now, scientists have made great progress in helping us reach, explore, and even briefly inhabit the harsh domain above us, but the rest of us are much slower to follow or even understand where the scientists are enabling us to travel. Many nations and even some corporations are exploring high above the Earth's atmosphere, testing the infinite number of ways that mastering space can help the 7.6 billion of us who live down here on the Earth. The space age is about 70 years old, and the foundational Outer Space Treaty is just over 50 years old. That should tell us something. Unfortunately, precious little has happened since the OST to organize human efforts in the inhuman space domain. Space is in danger of becoming the wild, wild west, where every satellite, astronaut, cosmonaut, or taikonaut has to defend himself. From their testimony, I see that our State Department experts are giving up on the concept of a law-abiding, rules-based space and settling for something less, like suggestions-based space, or probably even a hint-based space. Perhaps that's the best we can do, but I think that we should try harder for better. Can't we at least agree on agreements on space traffic management, on the size of safety zones around satellites or capsules, to ban debris, at least from ASATs, or to have compatible docking latches? There must be a consensus somewhere on Earth for the sensible. I look forward to the discussion with our witnesses, and I turn to today's honorary Strategic Forces ranking member, Mr. Doug Lamborn, for any opening remarks that he may have. Doug?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. And I want to thank you, Chairman Castro, and Ranking Member Maliotakis. Additionally, I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today to discuss this important issue. As this subcommittee has highlighted again and again, space is a vital component of our national security now more than ever. Not only that, but our global economy is totally dependent on access to space. Space, like the air and sea domains, is a common good that we all benefit from regardless of country of origin. But unlike those other domains, space is more likely to suffer a tragedy of the commons outcome as a result of bad actors. The physics of space leaves it susceptible to long-term damage from debris created by collisions, poorly conducted anti-satellite weapons and testing, and simply poor planning. The foundation international laws and norms that we're currently operating under were developed under the cloud of the Cold War and when only the two great powers could access space. As a result, the Outer Space Treaty doesn't account for the congested operations of space we see today. This treaty was also written with very broad language and phrases that are open to wide interpretation by signatories to the agreement. I do not believe China and Russia are operating in good faith when it comes to their proposals, as evidenced by the Treaty on Prevention of the Placement of Weapons in Outer Space, sometimes referred to as the No First Placement Treaty. This treaty proposed to ban weapons in outer space, but lacked any mechanism for verification, and also was silent on space debris caused by ASAT testing and rendezvous and proximity operations. Most notably, however, Russia and China are in many ways already weaponizing space, proposing a treaty upon which ratification they would already be in violation of. I was glad to see that the UK submitted a UN resolution to, quote, reduce space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors, unquote, to be considered by the UN General Assembly this summer as in a drive to make space safer and more sustainable. What I don't want is another international treaty that would tie our hands while others blatantly ignore its limitations, like the late Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. I also don't want to see a treaty where the U.S. receives almost no benefits while our adversaries do, like the now dead Open Skies Treaty. So I appreciate the continued service and experience that you all provide to the nation, and I look forward to our discussions today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. Now I turn to the Chairman Castro for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all. It's an honor to be here today with my colleagues from both committees to discuss one of the long-term challenges we face, not just as a nation, but as a species, space. Specifically, the rules that will govern humanity's exploration, commerce, and other activity within space, both by the private sector and nation states. I give special thanks to Chairman and Congressman Jim Cooper. He's chairman of the subcommittee on strategic forces, which oversees many of our nation's space programs, for working together with the House Foreign Affairs Committee and my staff on this important and historic joint hearing. In the long run, the peaceful exploration of space can be one of the most significant and unifying projects that our nation and our world has ever undertaken. As President Kennedy said of the moon mission, America's journeys to space, quote, will serve to organize and measure the best of our energy and skills. In short, spacefaring can bring out the best in us, leading to cutting-edge technologies, creating new jobs, making significant scientific discoveries, and perhaps, above all, uniting our divided nation behind a common purpose once more. I commend the Biden administration for pledging to continue ongoing plans to return Americans to the moon, and making clear part of this mission will be to land the first woman and person of color on the lunar surface, ensuring that this moon landing will be seen by Americans and the world as an accomplishment on behalf of all Americans. Yet, despite the goal of peaceful coexistence among the stars, space is not immune to the realities of international relations in a time of rising authoritarian powers, or to the global trend of increasing inequality and lack of corporate accountability. This hearing will serve to assess the current and future state of human activity in space and to inform a new American strategy for preserving the rule of law, peace, and international cooperation in the most hostile environment humanity inhabits. This is new territory, of course, for all of us. There's never been this many state and private actors all operating in space at once, with multiple different priorities and growing risks of clashes, both intentional and not. In many ways, the challenge in space is unlike any that humanity has faced before. It took centuries to shape the law of the sea, drawing upon thousands of years of human seafaring. We don't have 100 years to set the rules for space, nor do we have traditions to draw upon that fall beyond living memory. The reality is that space is already critical to the military capabilities of the United States, our allies, our partners, and our adversaries. The question is how we and other states will respond, and whether we will be able to develop a set of rules to manage disputes and develop a set of rules that will also work for all of us. The United States has engaged on these critical issues for decades at the United Nations and in other international organizations. The accelerating pace of human activities in space raises the urgency of re-engaging with our partners and establishing norms and rules. Earlier this week, the United States made a public declaration of what our nation's interests are in space, what threats we face, and how we will engage with the international community to establish norms of behavior. This is a critical task. We rely on space for almost everything we do as a society, to include navigation, accurate timekeeping, global communications, and weather. The number of satellites in space from both government and private actors will increase nearly tenfold in the next decade. Countries, including China, are developing the capabilities to disable or destroy satellites in space through missiles, other satellites, cyber attacks, or electronic warfare. And as the United States plans our return to the moon, That also raises the importance of minimizing the risk to astronauts in space. Congress must pay careful attention to all these issues and determine where the United States will stand on these crucial questions for space governance. This hearing will be one of the Foreign Affairs Committee's first significant opportunities to address these issues and to hear directly from the administration on what we're doing to build an international rules-based order to govern space that can meet the challenges of humanity's second spacefaring century. With that, I yield back, Chair.
Thank you so much, Chairman Castro. Now we turn to Ranking Member Maliotakis for her remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Cooper. As we set out to contribute to the development of a framework for rules-based order in space that serves American interests, there are two primary areas I wish to explore with our panel of government witnesses from the Department of Defense and State. First, my distinguished colleagues have already made reference to the impact of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, but it is the common heritage of humankind principle captured in the second preambular paragraph of the treaty, quote, recognizing the common interest of all humankind in the progress of the exploration and use of outer space for peaceful purposes, unquote, that I wish to highlight. This principle of international law holds that just as we are to treat our seas on Earth, outer space should be free for exploration and use for the benefit of all and shall be the province of all humankind. Further, it means outer space should be free from exploitation by any nation, state, or private corporation. I draw this out because we have seen the principle in practice under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, also known as UNCLOS. It was established to set out a comprehensive legal regime for the world's oceans. Despite being a party to this convention, China has acted without regard to its terms, even going so far as to ignore an international tribunal ruling that rejected the legality of China's maritime claims and behaviors from 2016. And nearly 5 years later, there has been no punitive action taken against China, and still China continues to act in contravention of the Law of the Sea Convention. Last month, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence issued its annual report of worldwide threats to U.S. national security, which includes sections on the threat of Russia and China's space programs. The report reflects the collective insights of the U.S. intelligence community and focuses on the most direct, serious threats to the United States during the next year. The report identifies China and Russia's anti-satellite weapons program and the threat these programs pose to U.S. terrestrial forces that rely on satellite-based communications. I share in the concerns conveyed by my armed services colleagues on the threat posed by China and Russia's space technology to the principle of common heritage of all humankind. Both nations' track records on the Earth's surface give more than sufficient reason to expect that their malign behavior will extend into orbit. The second aspect I wish to highlight is the commercial exploration of space. I marvel and join my colleagues in enthusiastically supporting the participation between NASA and commercial space exploration. The April 23rd launch of SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket from NASA's Kennedy Space Center, which propelled an international team of astronauts, Crew Dragon, in the endeavor to the International Space Station, is a perfect illustration of just how far we have come in space exploration. As with the safe return of the Crew 1 astronauts on the 2nd, while the U.S. government builds partnerships with private industry for China and Russia, there is no distinction between that which is state-owned and that which is privately owned, as their respective space programs are all state-owned. By extension, their programs serve both civil and military purposes. We have seen this script before in the Pacific waterways, where commercial fishing vessels are also used by China as maritime militia. And focused on these two areas, the principles of the heritage of humankind and commercial space exploration, because of one hand, they offer us opportunities to abiding nation states and future generations, but on the other, they represent dangerous risks resulting from nation states unwilling to be bound by a rules-based order and pursuing space technology that pose a direct threat to our nation's security. In our discussion, we must not cast aside these realities when world leaders negotiated the terms of the Outer Space Treaty in the days of the original Star Trek series, maintaining status was attainable. But today, as our global leaders pursue international norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior in outer space is now fiction. The U.S. and other nation states may abide by international norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior, but our competition acts with indifference to the same rules-based order. This is our current operating environment, and we must pursue a space policy that brings together our interests, but also addresses these challenges in space exploration. I welcome our esteemed panel of experts and yield the remainder of my time, which I suppose I ran out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Maliotakis. First, let me say that everyone should be muted except for the witnesses that I call on. So let me repeat, everyone should be muted. There's way too much background noise here. So please mute yourself. Our first witness for his 5-minute statement will be Mr. John Hill. Now, Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Chairman Cooper, Ranking Member Lambourne, Chairman Castro, and Ranking Member Maliotakis, distinguished members of the subcommittees. It's an honor to testify before you today along with my distinguished colleagues. You have my full written statement, and with your permission, I ask that it be included in the record. I will briefly summarize it.
Without objection, so ordered.
The U.S. government efforts to foster a rules-based international order in outer space are focused on establishing voluntary, non-legally binding measures derived from current technical and operational best practices. As one of the world's most experienced space operators, the Department of Defense actively supports and partners with the Department of State in developing U.S. proposals within international venues in order to shape the strategic environment toward an agreed-upon model for safe, responsible, and professional behavior. There are many benefits to having common guidelines for space operations. Among these are a safer, more sustainable, more stable, and more predictable space operating environment for all space operators. Importantly for DoD, such an operating environment can also facilitate indications and warnings of hostile intentions and hostile acts. DoD policies and practices often serve as the basis for international measures. DoD models responsible behavior through our routine space operations, and DoD works carefully to ensure that our space operations are consistent with international measures the United States supports and with relevant domestic and international law, including the law of armed conflict and the inherent right of self-defense. For example, not only are DoD operations fully consistent with the 2007 Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, but DoD practices also served as a source of the more rigorous standards adopted in the November 2019 United States Government Orbital Debris Mitigation Standard Practices. Likewise, for 10 years, the Department of Defense provided one of the lead U.S. delegates to the negotiations on the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space that produced the 2019 guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. This participation ensured consistency with DoD practices and greatly facilitated implementation of these guidelines. Most recently, DoD has supported the drafting of the United States National Submission in response to the 2020 United Nations General Assembly resolution on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors. From the DoD perspective,